Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Brooks. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research here at the University of Adelaide, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you. And before we get underway, can I acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land upon which the University of Adelaide's 4 campuses are built. Happy New Year to you all, if it's not too late in the year to wish you that, and welcome to the first in the 2014 Research Tuesdays series. I was reminded beforehand that this is the 8th year of a very successful series of public seminars, and I must say it's great to see you all here, especially on such a hot day. I don't know whether it actually did it reach 40 today? I'm sure it did. And I can't help thinking of the irony that we're going to be talking about a subject tonight who would have spent a great deal of time in much less than minus 40. So great to see you here in hot weather. So, over the next few weeks, we're going to be holding a series of events here at the university in conjunction with the SA Museum to mark the centenary of the return to South Australia of the Australasian Antarctic Expedition on the Aurora. And I'll say a little bit more about other events as I close this evening's event. But tonight we start with a celebration of the remarkable qualities and achievements of the University of Adelaide's legendary geologist and famous polar explorer, Sir Douglas Mawson. Mawson was a lecturer, then Professor of Geology and Mineralogy at the University of Adelaide between 1905 and 1952, and has left a tremendous legacy for this university and, of course, the wider world. We're privileged to have 3 speakers on the panel who bring a great deal of knowledge and insight to Mawson's life and achievements, and they are Mark Farrow, Emma McEwin, and Professor Alan Collins. Now, facilitating our forum this evening is Professor Karen Barovich, who is Professor of Geology here at the University of Adelaide and Deputy Executive Dean in the Faculty of Sciences. Her research focuses on Precambrian geology and evolution of the continental crust. Professor Barovich's office is in the Mawson Laboratories, built in 1952 and largely designed by Mawson himself to house his group of academics. It was named in honour of his national and international achievements. So please welcome Professor Karen Barovich and our panel for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mike. Now, unlike Mike, I have to put my glasses on to read. Well, I don't have to read this, though. I would just like to add to his warm welcome to our 2014 Research Tuesday series. As he said, it's been incredibly terrific, and I can't believe it's been going on for 8 years. I'm very pleased to be hosting this special presentation that celebrates Sir Douglas Mawson's achievements. As a geologist who, as Mike said, is housed in the Mawson Laboratories, and I work there every day, this theme is very close to my heart. So, the thing about Research Tuesdays are not about the academics just talking at you, the audience. To that end, we've set aside plenty of time. We're going to have discussion between the panel members after their presentations, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from the audience themselves. A little bit like ABC's Q&A. Not really, but you get the idea. We've brought this group together particularly because each one can very uniquely highlight in his or her own special way a particular aspect of Mawson and of his legacy. So we go from the nature of what Antarctic exploration was early in the 1900s. We move into a little brush of what Mawson was, the man himself, and the man behind the public image. And then finally we move to geological research today that happens in his building, and and the legacy that he gave to the geologists who work there now. So, all right, let's get stuck right in. Our first speaker is Mark Farrow. Now let me tell you a bit about Mark. He's the Senior Collection Manager at the SA Museum, where his responsibilities include running the Mawson Centre. The centre is the home of the Australian Polar Collection and includes the personal collection of Sir Douglas Mawson. And in fact, it is one of the largest such collections related to a polar explorer in the whole world. With Mark's ongoing research interest in aspects of Mawson's Aurora expedition, he's very well suited to discuss what he calls the heroic era. So join me in welcoming Mark.
Thanks. Just checking that you can all hear me. Is that okay? Great. People usually think that Mawson's great passion was rocks. And that's true to a certain extent, but I think he had a sneaking second interest in technology, science and technology in particular. And that's really what my particular talk is about. It's a historic day today to be looking at Mawson and the Aurora expedition of 1911 to 14. If we actually go back to Mawson's records, we would see on this day in 1914, so a century ago, that Mawson wrote in his diaries, "Wireless messages heard, a Marconi boat and Telefunken boat." And he goes on to give the latitude and longitude of that. It's quite far south, as we were talking about, it would have been cold. It's a lovely point for me because the wireless technology was in particular a critical aspect of Mawson's expedition for many different reasons. That's some sources from the Antarctic Diaries, by the way. That was probably the last great research project of the Mawson Institute that I'm aware of, and the director and his wife, Eleanor, edited the diaries of Mawson. It's a superb read even today. So I'd like to give you just a bit of a preview and an overview of Mawson and the era that he was set in, the exploration period. This is a very simple timeline. You'll see some key figures there. Scott, you've got Mawson, and you've got Shackleton. I'm using Mawson's own slides, digitized from the collection. The black is obviously the unknown, so this is back in 1775, Cook's era. The next one is 1821. That's the year that Antarctica was really discovered by a Russian expedition. Mawson then put in an 1845 one. There were a spate of expeditions in that year, or that sort of couple of years, French, American, and also British. And then the one that Mawson had in colour, which might have signified something more special, it was actually produced the year that Mawson came to the University of Adelaide. This one shows really the remaining part of Antarctica that was left to be puzzled over. They hadn't got to the South Geographic Pole, and you can see by this stage at least Australia was entirely known. So if we look at this map a little closer, you can see the region to the top, below Research Tuesdays in fact, is the area that is least known of all, it seems to me. There's a huge expanse there. The expeditions from about 1907 to 1912 were all going to be focused on the pole, Amundsen leading the way, and successfully with the use of dogs. But the English-speaking expeditions were particularly interested in technology. So I want to just touch on some of Mawson's, because I think it's quite an important insight into him. Probably most famous was his use of aircraft. He took an REP produced under Vickers by license, a monoplane back in 1911. It crashed here in Adelaide and was eventually taken as an air tractor to pull sledges. The other really interesting first to me is the wireless telegraphy. They can sometimes call this radio. The graphic here that I'm showing you is Macquarie Island, and there was a relay station set up there at great effort. If we move on to the main base, usually known as the home of the blizzard, remarkably, they managed to also establish wireless masts there for periods of time until they were blown down. And this is the overview for me of the wireless operations of the expedition. But the critical thing in the time we have is to be looking essentially at that main base. So at the main base in the first year, you had a guy called Walter Hannum, who was the operator. And it's generally viewed, and I put the note here, that they were unsuccessful in 1912 to get out messages. And the same applied for the western base, while the Aurora was pretty successful. And Macquarie Island was always outstandingly successful, particularly sending back weather reports. Just focusing on the main base, there's a suggestion in some of the research material that the first message that actually got out from the Antarctic was sent in that year. This is actually it in Morse code. What I'd like to do is play you it. which I'm going to do. Hopefully it's now playing. Maybe it won't be. Okay, here it goes. Thank you, Karen. It might sound a little shrill, but it was a remarkable achievement. I would argue, and I'll mute it now, I would argue that actually achieving wireless communications in that year had a profound importance. For the first time in Antarctic history, the seasonal sort of death grip that allowed no contact with the outside world during the winter and spring months was cracked open. And today, if you go to the Antarctic, particularly for work, you can't get away from communications. They'll get at you 24 hours a day. So in Mawson's time, this was really a spectacular achievement. The funny thing was that message, and that says basically, alas for poor Lasseron, seems to have been, in typical Australian fashion, a joke. They were testing the wireless that year, and freakishly, a message got from the Antarctic to at least southern Australia, maybe to Pennant Hills in Sydney. It was a remarkable achievement. To finish with, and this is the point that I would like to focus on, there's traditionally a suggestion that the heroic era begins sometimes in the 1890s and finishes, depending on your authority. The Fishers would argue about 1922, as you can see here. Philip Law argued 1916, which was the end of the Shackleton expedition. And I would argue, purely because of that wireless communication, that 1912 actually forever changed the Antarctic and our relationship with it. There's a lovely publication, Mawson's Forgotten newspaper, and it describes how almost every day they were getting information in the second year, and that allowed them to almost have a daily newspaper to be reading. There is also a suggestion in this last graphic that a recent academic in New South Wales, Chris Turney, may have continued the AAE sort of spirit. His expedition that you may have heard about, and we may talk about in the question and answers, was called The Spirit of Mawson, and it reflected very much the old and the new science of the Antarctic. So hopefully that's provided some insights. I'll leave you with those last maps, which shows here Mawson's Land of Hopeless Glory, which he described, the region between Gaussberg and Cape Adare. And at the end of the expedition, you can see that region basically from this point right over to almost the Ross Sea had been charted and to some extent discovered. 2,000 kilometres of man-hauling sledges for the main part. So on that note, I think my 5 minutes are well and truly up. I will finish there and let the next speaker start.
Thanks very much for that, Mark. I think we'll be able to elaborate on some of those points. Am I working? No. Sure, I can switch. Actually, I lecture here with no microphone at all, so I probably don't need one, but that's all right. Okay, our next speaker is Emma McEwin. Emma is currently undertaking a PhD in creative writing at the University of Adelaide. Her thesis is a biographical history of the Mawson family, inspired by objects and artifacts that have circulated over the years. Her research makes her well placed to comment on Mawson's life as a whole. And also, incidentally, she is Mawson's great-granddaughter. So join me in welcoming Emma up. If you need it, but you can just advance with the button if you like.
Good evening. Thanks, Karen. As Karen mentioned, I'm working on a PhD thesis about Douglas Mawson, and just wanted to expand on what it is that I'm doing and trying to write about him. As Karen mentioned, it's inspired by objects and artefacts that have circulated in both the private sphere and in the public domain. And each chapter is a self-contained story. It's a little non-fiction story focusing on a different object or set of objects. And some of these material traces perpetuate Mawson's mythic status such as this photograph of him taken by Frank Hurley in 1929, and others open up lesser-known stories about him and about the lives he's touched. As an exploration of his many lives, from his public image as an explorer to his private roles as a husband and father, it considers the making and unmaking of myths surrounding a nationally iconic figure and explores the impact of Mawson's legacy on family lives across generations. So I was just going to read you a little bit from the preface of my PhD. Regrettably, the life of Douglas Mawson, my paternal great-grandfather, ended before mine had even begun. I came to know him through the things he had left behind: his reindeer skin sleeping bag, his yellow snow goggles, his photograph on our mantelpiece, bearing an uncanny likeness to my father. As a child, I looked through his book, The Home of the Blizzard, and other books about his expeditions, admiring the pictures. Cecil Madigan, unrecognisable, with a film of ice over his face, newly hatched baby penguin chicks, a bull elephant seal rearing up on a Macquarie Island beach, Mertz and Ninnis, whose eyes somehow told me that they knew of their impending deaths. The photograph of Mawson leaning against his sledge, his head bowed, waiting to set off on the journey only he would survive, has a look of sorrow about it, as if he too sensed something of the tragedy that awaited them. Unlike his two sledging companions, Ninnis and Mertz, Mawson's life did not end in the snow when he was a young man, but in 1958 when he was aged 76. He spent 50 years at the University of Adelaide, 30 as Professor of Geology. He published 100 research papers, only a fraction of which were related to Antarctic science. He was a husband and a father, a farmer, a conservationist, an officer in the First World War. Yet he is both remembered and forgotten because of his survival in the Antarctic in 1913. Consistently defined and confined by the public status of his polar experience, it has somehow pared him down, simplified him, reduced him to the man who ate his husky dogs to survive, who cut his sledge in half with his pocket saw, who fell down a crevasse and hauled himself to the surface. The objects and artefacts associated with him inevitably come back to this one story, which has not only obscured and diminished other aspects of his life and work, but also the contributions and achievements of the men who went to the Antarctic with him and the lives of his wife, Bakita, and daughters, Pat and Jessica. From a family perspective and from the perspectives of those who knew him, Mawson was a complex figure, private figure, as well as a publicly revered explorer. Seen through their eyes, he is freed from being a face glued to envelopes, bought and sold, pigeonholed and pinned down. He floats out of the frame of his balaclava, out of the crinkled edges of the stamps enclosing his image, and comes to life and to light as a man who had many faces and many lives. As I grew up, I randomly collected the small details of his life and personality. He had blue eyes and stood 6'3" in his socks. He used to feed his fowls grapes through the holes of their wire enclosure. He had a habit of beginning lectures with a loud sniff. He liked musical comedies, poetry and biographies, fine furniture, trees and cats, rice pudding and creme caramel. He enjoyed shopping at the Adelaide Central Market and tossing pancakes on Shrove Tuesday. Unsurprisingly, he had a strong constitution, a high pain threshold and an astonishing resistance to the cold. Uninterested in sport, he was intolerant of fools and kind to little boys, demanding of his men and ambitious for his daughters. He was a prolific letter writer, a bad driver, a good shot, a fast walker, a poor sailor. Lying loose in family cupboards and drawers, boxes and envelopes, and in old dog-eared albums with insects mummified between the pages were pictures of him in many guises: on his wedding day puffing out his chest, on a river holiday assisting a laughing Bakita into a dinghy, clean-shaven and serious by a campfire, his hands on his hips, bearded and pensive in the cabin of a ship, in a Homburg helping the Duchess of York trail on some wolfskin mitts. Flawed and contradictory like anyone else, he was at once resourceful and extravagant, organised and muddled, helpful and meddlesome, friendly and aloof. Some say he was humorless, others remember his keen sense of fun and his lusty sense of humour. While some thought him pessimistic, imposing and imperious, others described him as a gentleman and unfailingly optimistic, whose enthusiasm was infectious. This year, 2014, marks the centenary since the end of the Australasian Antarctic Expedition of 1911 to 14. And in the years leading up to the centenary of this event, much previously unseen or lesser seen material has been published, including the diaries of sailors and members of the expedition's land parties. The release of this material has sparked new speculation about Mawson both as a man and as a leader, some of which sets to challenge his apparently heroic status. Historian David Day argues that Mawson was a seeker of fame and fortune, a man who actively promoted his own myth and who suppressed, even handicapped, those who threatened to outshine him. Among Day's claims are that Mawson avoided conscription in World War I, that when a married man he enjoyed a mad summer of love in 1916 with Robert Scott's widow Kathleen, that his relative inexperience, overweening ambition and poor decision-making caused the deaths of both Ninnis and Mertz, and that he was an ineffectual, overly critical leader whose primary interest was territorial acquisition, with science acting as a cover. It is perhaps inevitable that well-known historical figures become positioned as either hero or anti-hero, but either status is a feature of the dehumanising nature of myth. As complex a human being as any one of us, Mawson was neither entirely good nor entirely bad, and nor like anyone else can he be truly understood. Yet to appreciate his complexities and the effect of his fame on those close to him, to engage with the tension between private and public personas, is to break open the limiting power of myth and bring to light what Virginia Woolf called the invisible presences that play such an important part in binding together any life. Thank you.
So much, Emma. I look forward to being able to pursue some of those insights when we have the question and answer session. Okay, wait. Glasses back on. So our last speaker and panel member is Professor Alan Collins. Alan is a professor in geology at the University of Adelaide and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. His research interests, in fact, owe much to the legacy of Mawson's research into ancient glaciated environments as Alan concentrates on better understanding the geography of the world at the time of the ancient glaciations that Mawson himself described throughout South Australia. As part of geology and geophysics at the University of Adelaide, Alan can highlight for us Mawson's legacy in earth sciences.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Karen said, I'm a geologist working in the Mawson laboratories just over there. I'm not going to talk about Mawson specifically. I'm going to talk about a little bit of his legacy in terms of what he's provided for students in this university, but also a little just a research story about how some of his research that he did in South Australia that was a bit related to the Antarctic work, how that sort of developed over the years. We'll try and be quite brief, so let's see how we go. Well, first of all, so you can probably tell I'm not from South Australia, and growing up I had never heard of Mawson. I think I first heard of Mawson when I started going to university in the University of London. But I'd heard of Mawson's research legacy in geology, and I'd heard of the geology done in the University of Adelaide that had passed on from that. Now, Mawson as we've heard, came to the University of Adelaide in 1904, 1905. He didn't start the Geology Department. That's what you sometimes hear it termed as. He was preceded by Tate, Woolnough and Houchin. But he came here as one of only 2 staff in geosciences. What he did do, though, during his tenure in the University of Adelaide is he took it from this very small department with very few students. There were only 4 honours students that graduated from 1921 to 1940. And he took it to a school of geosciences with 2 departments, with 6 continuing academics, and with between 5 and 10 honours students graduating a year. Still quite a small foundation compared to today. But what that's enabled us to do is to build from that over the decades after Mawson left the university and turn this group of geoscientists in this university into, I'm going to say it, the best geoscience group of academics and students in the country. We're certainly the largest. We now have 40 to 50 honours graduates a year in both geology and geophysics, which is in the Mawson laboratories, and in a unique Adelaide institution, the Australian School of Petroleum, which is just over there. We have about 100 students in each of our final year classes. Our teaching numbers haven't quite caught up, but we're hoping to get better on that. We could always do with a few more staff. And when Mawson came to this university in 1904, 1905, he started researching, and he started researching in the Alari region, and Alari and Broken Hill region up in the northeast. Part of the reason for that was that Walter Houchin, who was here already, had got a lot of the ground covered. He was working a lot in the Adelaide Hills and up in the Flinders Ranges. Whilst he was there, he had a lot of interest in mineralogy, and he got very interested in the radioactive minerals you find in what later became Radium Hill. He also found, whilst he was there, these funny bouldery rocks. Oops, so sorry, there's some of our student classes, I should have showed that. These bouldery rocks, it's a rock type called a diamic type, but basically it's just a load of pebbles in a lot of mud, and that's pretty much it. Now, these had been discovered in the Adelaide region by Walter Houchin before, very similar looking rocks. Now, Walter Houchin, he discovered these. In fact, you can see them today if you just go in the Sturt River Gorge, just about a mile up from, or even a few hundred metres up from where the South Road crosses the Sturt River. You can see these rocks very much like these. And Walter Houchin had come up with a very wacky explanation for these, that these were deposits from glaciers. It's a bit strange at a 30-odd degrees latitude. Now, this was incredibly controversial at the time, in the beginning of the 20th century. There was a lot of to and fro and argument about them because it has really quite strange implications. Mawson agreed with Houchin on this. He didn't necessarily agree with Houchin on very much, but he did agree with Houchin on this, that these were deposits of ancient glaciers. And actually that was one of the reasons, or one of the excuses anyway, for Mawson going down south on his first trip down south in 1907 with Shackleton and Edgeworth David, was to try and get a better understanding of recent glacial deposits to better interpret these ones he was finding in southern Australia. Now, you might think this was quite a strange thing to do because he was actually employed on that first expedition as a physicist, but in those days, scientific disciplines were a little bit more mutable than they are today, and as soon as he got down to Antarctica, he was very much grabbed over onto the geology program. So it's quite interesting to think what Mawson, and Houchin as well for that matter, would have thought these represented, because this was way before people came up with plate tectonics or continental drift. It was years before people fully appreciated that continents can move around. So they had to interpret these things as representing ancient, extreme climate change, glaciers over Australia, glaciers up at 30 degrees latitude. Now, a few years after that, Wegener in 1912 published his continental drift hypothesis, largely ridiculed by the scientific establishment. It wasn't really until the 60s and early 70s that people came to understand with the much fuller explanation of plate tectonics that continents do move around. They move around a lot. So you'd think, no problem. Okay, Australia was just further south when these were deposited. These are quite old, by the way. They're about 500, 600, 700 million years old, these rocks. So there's no problem there. The problem comes in that since then we've also managed to get techniques for working out where continents were at different times, what latitude continents were at different times. We can look at the frozen magnetic record, the frozen magnetic field, fossilized magnetic field in iron-bearing minerals. And when we look at these rocks, we find that they were actually deposited near the equator, in fact further north than where they are today. So it's sort of come full circle, this. The present hypothesis for the formation of these is that they were actually glaciers or ice at the equator. That we are looking at the products, as Mawson suspected and Houchin suspected, of extreme climate change 600 million years ago. Now, I won't be too long, Karen, I promise. It turns out we go everywhere in the world. And this is a picture from the Hagar Mountains in Oman, and it's a bit of a plug because I was there a couple of weeks ago. It's fantastic. And there you can see very similar rocks, exactly the same age. You see they're all lots of pebbles sitting in loads of mud. They're capped with a bit of a limestone here, so that's all those rocks, and they're capped with a bit of a limestone on top, which is sort of what you see everywhere of rocks of this age. So it is in Oman. Oman, Arabia. Yeah. But you can see them in Namibia, you can see them all over the place, actually, in Southern Africa. In Spitsbergen, actually, as well, in the UK. And it seems as though this cold period was pretty widespread over the globe at this time. It's actually lent itself to a geological time period called the Cryogenian, which means birth of cold, very imaginatively. This transition from these rocks up into these limestones, again, is something that appears to occur at the same time everywhere in the world. And it's lent itself to what we call in geology a golden spike, which is where someone says, there's the transition from one geological period to another geological period. This one is the only one that's defined on some rocks in Australia. You can find it in Enorama Creek in the central Flinders Ranges, just near Bratchner Gorge. And it goes from these pebbly, bouldery, glacial rocks to this limestone, and that's the international definition of where one geological time period changes into another one. The one above it is called the Ediacaran, after our very own Ediacaran Hills. So Mawson's legacy, Mawson's legacy is vast, as we appreciate, but aspects of his legacy are developing one of the strongest geoscience departments in the country, giving opportunities for students here, and also in us understanding a lot more about the extremes of what our Earth is capable of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. And I would suggest that Mawson would probably love to talk to you about these rocks. Okay, so now we come on to this session of question and answer. And what we're going to do first is invite the panel up to these chairs. And we're just going to let them elaborate a bit on some of the things they weren't able to go into detail about. So I've got a few questions for them, and hopefully we'll generate some discussion amongst themselves. But then we'll have plenty of time to take questions from the audience, and I believe that we'll have some microphones to run around. So we'll just spend a few minutes with a few elaborations on what they've covered, and then we'll go into audience questions. Sound good? Yeah. Okay. Great. I think I'm supposed to sit here. I hope I don't fall down. I'm not going to sit there. I'll fall off that. I might get us all the way back to Mark. And you mentioned this heroic era, and you had it on one of your slides. What exactly is that heroic era?
It's an interesting question. As I say, the periods of Antarctic exploration have been divided up. The heroic era was I think, defined by the drive that was human-powered. I mean, there was steam and there was sail power, but it came down to exploration on foot in a very non-mechanized era. And that's why, again, the next period after that was the mechanized era.
Human power you raised, and that brings me to a question to Emma then. Talking about human power, what qualities and sort of experiences do you think that might explain Mawson's survival of the Far Eastern sledging journey in 1213?
Well, he already had some Antarctic experience, which certainly helped. He'd been on a very long sledging journey of 1,200 miles on foot to the vicinity of the South Magnetic Pole. And very few people on his expedition had any experience of those icing conditions and of a long sledging journey. And he was naturally frugal as well. He'd grown up and had a fairly sort of Spartan childhood, but I think it was also his character as well. So that helped him be, I think he was very resourceful and innovative in those situations.
Mark, in your mind, would that particular event epitomize what you call the heroic era? Or did he have the telegraph by then and negated it?
It didn't quite epitomise it, I think. I think it's overshadowed still by the Scott sledging party debacle and loss of the entire team of 5. But it's so characteristic of that type of exploration. I think for Australians, seeking perhaps their own Australian hero, Mawson fits that bill and of course survived. There's been a suggestion that had Mawson been with Scott, and he was offered a position verbally with Scott on that very party, he would never have died in a tent. He would have died out in the field, struggling back to base, which is, it's an image that I could really agree with.
Alan, you mentioned a number of times students. In what way do you think that students today are aware of Mawson's legacy to the university and to geology?
Well, it's one of the things I've only been at the University of Adelaide for 10 years, coming over from West Australia originally, and then London before that. But it's one of the things I really like at the university here, because I like the history behind it. I like the fact that there's a clear line in what we teach the students with what was taught 100 years ago, and you can see it progressing. You can tell these stories that are based in research about how what we now think happens in geology is taught. I love the fact that the first years to go into the Mawson Lecture Theatre, stand in the Tate Museum and get to look at all the remains of the Mawson expeditions and some of the rocks he brought back and all the rocks and minerals. Do go and have a look at the Tate Museum. It's just over there. It's open every day. If you've got any interest in rocks and Mawson memorabilia. So I like that sort of the grounding, I guess, we can give the students based on the people who've been here and what they've done before.
Good. Alan, I agree with that too. The Mawson legacy really actually does run deep in the geologists who work in the building. Emma, so maybe I'll just cut to a question here on my list. What then do you make of the current criticism of Mawson by writers such as David Day? And I guess that criticism was strictly related to his expeditions and not to the quality of his geological work in southern Australia. But what do you make of those?
I wouldn't say it was strictly related to his expeditions. There were quite a few personal attacks on his character. But I think it's really important that we question leaders and we question their motives and the decisions they make, and that we keep it as an ongoing open discussion, and that we're careful not to worship, national figures. But I think it's also important to be fair and balanced in the way that you open up that criticism. And I think in David Day's case, he doesn't always contextualise his arguments and doesn't sort of put Mawson into the context of his time or in an Antarctic context. And so I think, as I mentioned in my talk, that we can be in danger of going the other way too much as well, and that's also creating a myth, a negative myth, and he doesn't become a complex person but remains a sort of either an entirely good or an entirely evil figure. So I think we have to be careful of that.
Mark, that then leads to another very current issue of controversy. Let me just make sure I get these details right. Chris Turney's AE 2013-14 In the Spirit of Mawson expedition can be viewed, as you hinted at, to be an extension of the Mawson venture, and he advertised it as such. Is there really enough relevant science that was out there en route to the main base to even have made that expedition worthwhile, especially given the added cost that was incurred by the expedition?
Yeah, the Antarctic factor. I think the interesting thing that Chris has pointed out in terms of the science is that the Australasian Antarctic Expedition and Mawson's later British, Australian, New Zealand Antarctic Research Expedition, or Banzari, they covered especially the main base, and Mawson returned there and carried out more work, as I say, in 29 to 30. But there was nothing really done there since. So Chris decided to take this challenge up and try and get a young bunch of scientists back there and just see how good the science was at the time and the continuity of that. And he was surprised at so little being done. Most of the Antarctic Division's work is much further to the west. So the mission had a really great intention, and they certainly discovered a lot. I'm not here to defend him and what happened, and particularly maybe the expense that's still, I believe there's a check still floating around somewhere in the ether to be paid for by someone. But I think it just reminds us that the science is still there. There's still an awful lot to find out. And that's what makes life so exciting.
Well, getting back onto this question of science and Mawson, Alan, this issue of this jumble of pebbles being from a glacier, okay, first of all, why would Mawson have thought that when he did that research? Why is that concluded now? And you didn't really elaborate on how we could have glaciers at that latitude. Have we had glaciers in the tropics since then, and what could be the explanation for that?
Well, there's a nice little question. No, it's a good point, and they do just look like a big bundle of rocks, and that's what sort of diamictite means. It just means a sort of mix. And they were incredibly controversial at the time. They still are incredibly controversial, actually. how you actually tell that a bundle of coarse rocks and fine rocks were dumped by a glacier and not just a landslide, or as was thought at the time, they were thought to be disrupted beds because of some tectonic movements. They just sort of broke apart. That's what Ralph Tate thought, for instance, to form these Sturt Gorge rocks. One of the things that people use as conclusive, what they like to use as reasonably conclusive evidence, is some of those boulders. If you look at them in detail, and I have set this up. There you go. Here's one by magic. This is actually from a paper by Houchen in 1908, and you can see all these funny little scratches on it. You see all these little marks, and they're in different orientations. That's also quite important. They were used as evidence that these things had been dragged, and they'd been dragged by something solid, ice. They'd been dragged over something hard, another rock, or the side of a glacier. And it's argued you can't do this just by moving things along in water. And certainly if you go to the mouth of a snout of a modern glacier, like in New Zealand, for instance, you'll see lots of boulders that do look like this. They get quite polished, but you get all these grooves and scratches where they've been dragged across something. If you go to Hallett Cove and you look at Black Cliff on the north side of Hallett Cove, on the top there, you can see scratches in solid rock like this. So that's often used as evidence for ice transport. So I say they were controversial now. There are still people that argue against this now. You ask, do you get glaciers, or do you get glaciers at the equator? Well, we do actually today get glaciers at the equator, but they're rapidly diminishing. There's one on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, 6,000, 5,000 something meters up in the air. The point with these is there's good evidence they were deposited at sea level as well. So glaciers at sea level near the tropics. And this is the evidence that leads some people to suggest that the whole Earth was frozen at this time. Some of you may have heard of this wacky idea of the snowball Earth, and that's sort of where this comes from. That the Earth, because there were glaciers at sea level at the equator, therefore there must be ice everywhere. That's the logic.
Because you're exposed to two geologists here, I want Alan to comment just a little bit on Hallett Cove, because I want to make sure that people don't confuse the outcrops you've shown with the outcrop at Hallett Cove and the tillite there. Yeah, we live in a funny state, don't we? We have, there's not much ice kicking around in South Australia at the moment, but we have evidence in this state for at least 3 quite major glaciations, at least 2 in the Precambrian, so this one that Mawson looked at, and one a little bit older than that. You can see evidence for that in the Adelaide Hills and up in the Flinders Ranges. And then a much younger one, geologically happened yesterday, as particularly Karen works on very old rocks. This only happened 250 million years ago, this Hallett Cove glaciation. And that's the thing you can see evidence for in Hallett Cove. And Inman Valley, the Inman Valley was actually an ancient 250 million year old valley that was carved out by one of these younger glaciations. But it's incredible, isn't it? There's 3 glaciations, but that's still not the glaciations people talk about in the Northern Hemisphere, all the glaciations that people were involved in, and Neanderthal man and had something to do with, and woolly mammoths. They're much younger glaciations than all of that. We don't see any evidence for those in South Australia. There's a little bit in Victoria, New South Wales and Tassie, but yeah. I might just put one more question to Emma, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience, because I know you've got a ton of questions, but this is actually something that I would have wanted to ask you, and I know I won't get the chance. So based on all of your research, your family history, the stories, what are your impressions of Mawson? Mawson as a person, not as a geologist, not as a heroic explorer, but just as a person.
Well, it's interesting because I think when you're researching, there are times where you sort of have revelations and you think you know exactly what he was like, and other times he eludes me. But I think if I had to weigh up all the things that I've read about him and all the things that I know, I would say, I imagine he was a little on the square side, that I think he had a sense of humour, but I think it was probably quite sort of simple, not sophisticated humour, and that I think he was hard worker. Could be a touch boring. I mean, in the sense that I think he wasn't very good at relaxing and wasn't sort of one of the boys. Sort of, I think he was. I always think of him as being very active, very busy. Always lots of things on the go. Apparently, his desk at uni was pretty untidy, and he'd be burrowing his way through to find things, but he'd always find them. But I think he didn't want to throw anything away, and because in case he might need it. So there's sort of all these things at hand. So, and yeah, I think he could probably be a little bit intimidating, but I think he was also probably quite friendly, and the students remember him as being very approachable and always helping them. But I don't think he would have had much time for people who were time wasters, or who I just don't think he had much humour about that sort of thing. So
I would like to point out that the offices that the staff have in the Mawson building are probably bigger than the Vice Chancellor's, and maybe that is a reflection of his desire to keep everything, a bit of a pack rat mentality.
And possibly too, because he had such confined space in the hut. I think, and his design for his house here in Adelaide was sort of big and spacious, so I think that was possibly a reflection of that too.
Very good. Well, I think that we might see if we can field some questions from the audience, because I suspect there will be some. So we have a couple of microphones that are going to run around. And if there's anything you'd like to ask of any of the panel members, please just raise your hand and they'll come and find you. I can see one way in the back left, so you'll get your exercise first thing. And if I could just see another hand so that we're prepared to head to that one.
I can't remember who it was, but one of you mentioned about Mawson being a conservationist. Hypothetically, what do you think he would be saying and doing as far as climate change is concerned, if he were alive today?
You can answer.
I think that might have been Mark who mentioned that.
It was actually me.
But Emma may also have some comment on that. But we'll let you start.
Emma owned up to it, but but I would say, I think the term I would use for Mawson was probably sustainable development. I think conservation at the time was a bit different, but he really, it may go back to this idea of the frugal upbringing. He didn't like waste. He didn't like the idea of, for instance, whaling. If you had no idea of how many whales were out there, how fast they reproduced. So, he wanted the information, and then you could mount a strong argument and maybe a counter-argument. So, without appearing too biased, personally, I think he'd be astonished that there's still so much, confusion, lack of leadership on such a critical matter. And he didn't tolerate fools. He didn't tolerate theories he didn't like either. I would personally suggest that he would have quite liked this. It might have fixed some of the geological mysteries that we've been hearing about tonight. That's mine.
Emma, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think similarly to Mark. And recently I was looking at an interview of one of the men who went with Mawson on his on the AE, and he said that he felt that he was asked in the interview what he thought was Mawson's greatest legacy, and he said probably his campaigning for the whales. So that was interesting, because it's probably not the first thing people think of. But yeah, I think it was a combination, as Mark said, of using resources, but controlling.
Very good, thank you. We've got one down here in the front, please.
Is it working? Yes, thanks for all the lectures. I'm of course very interested in all this. I'm science graduate from Adelaide University. My name's Paquita. I'm one of the grandchildren. And I have noticed that my grandfather was very quickly able to turn Macquarie Island into a conservation area. He was very disappointed in how slow that Australia was to decimalize. That campaign was a lot harder. It's very easy to make a distant island a conservation area and out of sight, out of mind. His contribution for whaling was that he suggested that Australia run a top-notch whaling industry and show the world how to do it, which the Commonwealth Government did. They developed a top-notch whaling industry and, as Mark said, kept good records and made sure it was sustainable. And the question I was going to ask was that I went to a function at this university once and an academic sort of attacked me afterwards and said, "Your grandfather was a faulty scientist." I said, "Oh, what on earth are you talking about?" And he said, he didn't accept continental drift. And I said, well, nobody did it at that time because the continents were not known to be drifting. They thought the world had a hard core, that we didn't know we were all floating around. He said, no, that wasn't his problem. As a scientist, you must observe the evidence and work with that. And my question is, how does this work? I mean, with climate change, we're observing evidence. If even Mawson got it wrong, how can we use that evidence correctly? Because we don't know what we don't know. This is the complexity.
Alan.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, I'll try and address that on two bits. First of all, you're quite right about, of course, about continental drift. In fact, it's quite interesting how that idea evolved, because continental drift is always associated with Wegener, but it was actually proposed much earlier, and in the early part of the 19th century it was quite popular. Charles Lyell talks about it, he's a well-known geologist, talks about it. But it was the American geologist Dana in the middle 19th century that really put a kibosh on it. He poured cold water on it, said there was this theory of permanence, as you said, everything was solid and nothing could move. So, the idea was around early on in Mawson's career, and of course then it came to fruition with Wegener, but he was ridiculed. But he wasn't ridiculed quite as much as we sort of hear in the media or in the sort of the popular historians today. There were quite a lot of people who liked the idea. There's a fantastic reconstruction of Gondwana done in the 1920s by the South African geologist whose name just completely escapes me at the moment. I do apologise, but Mawson did Detroit, and Mawson did enter into quite a dialogue with him, correspondence with him. There's some of his papers in the Bar Smith on that subject. I don't think Mawson was completely against it. He just, I think most scientists at that time wanted some evidence rather than it just looks like it does, which was pretty much Wegener's. It was, South America, Africa do that. And some of Wegener's things were completely wrong. Madagascar looks like it fits against Mozambique. It does. If you look on a map, it doesn't. It came from somewhere up here. So, that can be oversimplified. So I don't think, he certainly wasn't a man outside his time or outside the scientific centre during the continental drift debates. And why plate tectonics won everyone over is because there was a mechanism. You could see crust forming in the oceans. You could actually show that it moved.
And that only came to us when we had the technology to see that, and they just didn't. Those scientists in those times didn't have that technology.
Yeah. So, but going on to the as you say, what do we do now with this climate change? Again, from a geological perspective, climate change is a no-brainer. It happens all the time. But of course, everyone's talking about anthropogenic climate change. I mean, climate change happens. We did have ice at the equator 500 million years ago. The Pleistocene, only a few million years ago, had much more ice, down to about 40 degrees latitudes in the northern hemisphere, even lower in North America.
Renmark used to be beach country.
Yeah. So
real
climate
estate.
change happens for sure. So then it's just, and again, it's not exaggerating. It's saying that 99.9% of scientists are very convinced with anthropogenic climate change. There really isn't a debate in the scientific literature. And I know the media takes that and picks a couple of people, and there have been people in this university as well, that have been quite prominent on that. But really in the science literature, it's not a debate. And so I'm absolutely convinced Mawson would have been, I think, I've read quite a few of his papers. He's a very careful scientist, I think, and quite a careful observationist. And I think he would just be like most scientists. It's not a debate, it's happening.
It's much harder than decimalisation and despair. It's a much harder political move than decimalisation.
And so that's, of course, the next step, is what do you do about it?
Yeah, so it's out of scientists' hands, it's into the public arena, and that's the problem.
Yeah, but again, I think that's something that, we've got a lot to thank Mawson for, because again, I think he was one of those scientists who did actually manage to get listened to and did manage to make some changes. You could argue it's much harder to do that now.
Thank you. I think we've got a question just halfway up.
Thank you. The Ediacaran demarcation makes us think of Reg Sprigg, I guess.
Sure.
Also perhaps mythologised and slighted at times. Did he overlap with Mawson, and what was their relationship? I understand it wasn't always equable.
Well, so long before my time, and I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if there's people in here who know this better than me, but I'll say what I know. So Reg Sprigg was a student of Mawson's, and there's if you read some of Reg's writings, there's great anecdotes of him going out in the field with Mawson. Mawson used to take all the students in the honours and third year classes up into northern Flinders Ranges, and I believe, and I could, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Mawson introduced Reg to that whole sort of northern Flinders Ranges region whilst he was a student. So you're right, and again, I've heard stories of little disagreements at times, but I think that's probably the personalities of the two men. But I also am very aware that Reg Sprigg very much respected Mawson all the way through for his life.
Emma or Mark, do you have any insight? Emma, have you looked much about the relationship with some of the later geologists in Mawson's life?
Not really. I mean, I do touch on Reg Sprigg, but no, not really.
Sorry, I just...
I was going to say either, yeah.
No, it's just to jump in from that, something I was thinking. I mean, again, it's something about Mawson's legacy that's bigger than just the things that we have heard of that he did. Of course, is the way he mentored students that themselves made a big impact. And Reg Sprigg is a great example. Reg Sprigg, again, people know of him because of Aurora, understandably. But he also founded Beach Energy. He was also one of the founders of Santos Energy. He explored for minerals in the Musgraves Ranges. He did loads of stuff in offshore and surveyed the Gulf of St Vincent. It was incredible legacy. At least part, we are the product of our teachers in many respects, and so I think Mawson has a lot of legacy in the people he mentored.
Good. I think up there in the aisle.
Got a comment and a question. The comment is, my grandfather went in 1911. He was a 22-year-old Adelaide graduate, and he was a magnetician on the Western Party. He went back again in 1929, and I think that would probably signify that he got on pretty well with Mawson. He always spoke very highly of him, and I met Paquita and most of the family, but certainly from my grandfather's point of view, there was never a problem with Sir Douglas Mawson. My question is that he was the magnetician on the Western Party, and when he helped triangulate the magnetic pole, it was on the continent. I was interested in your map to see if you can show me where that was and where the Western Party was. When I went down there a few years ago by aeroplane, it was in the ocean. So what's happening to the South Magnetic Pole?
I don't know where it is now.
So it moves around. They both move around. The North and the South Magnetic Pole move.
That much, though?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at any map, any topographic map, you'll see a decent topographic map, you should see a grid north arrow and you should see a magnetic north arrow. and there'll be an angle between them. That's the angle between the declination of where the magnetic pole is from the north one, the true north. But it should also say underneath it, it changes by so many minutes or seconds per year, and it changes wherever you happen to be on the globe. So they move around, and they move around quite fast. So it's
only
one of
100 years, but
yeah, no, they move around pretty quick.
maybe.
But over time, and this is one of the things that makes this determination of latitude of ancient things quite difficult, because the magnetic poles move. And the big assumption everyone makes is they move, but they just sort of move around the true north and true south poles, which they seem to.
I think I'm right in saying that it wasn't until 2000 that Charlie Barton on the Sir Hubert Wilkins actually managed to reach the south magnetic pole. I mean, it's drifting fairly slowly in a direction towards Adelaide, in fact, and now over the ocean. But in a 24-hour cycle, it's actually moving quite fast. And it wasn't until it stopped momentarily that the ship managed to catch it. So ending the quest for the South Magnetic Pole that Mawson, of course, had been so instrumental in back in 1908, 1909. So you find him everywhere, yes.
Why and how?
Oh, there you go. Why and how do the poles move?
So the magnetic field of the Earth is generated in the outer core. Okay, so the center part of the Earth is solid. It's under incredible pressure, and it's made of iron and nickel and not much else. The outer core is also made out of iron and nickel because it's a little bit further from the center. It's at a slightly lower pressure. It's extremely hot, so it's actually liquid there, and it convects rapidly. In fact, it's thought to have the viscosity of water, so it's really fluid. It's not sticky, it's really fluid. And it convects rapidly, and that generates the magnetic field. So that's basically what we know, right?
Why does that move?
Well, so it moves around, so you've got lots of charged particles moving around, which create a magnetic field. Sorry?
Why does that move? Because the Earth moves?
So why doesn't that form a stable magnetic field? It's because the convection is so vigorous that it can't form beautiful stable convection cells. No, but I think it's fair to say that no one can model absolutely precisely how the magnetic field works. One of the big mysteries is why it flips every now and again. Not in our lifetimes, but it flips every few 100,000 years, and no one really understands that because that doesn't seem to have a pattern.
On average, we're overdue for a flip, in fact.
North Pole becomes the South Pole, and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. Your compass needle points the other way. It's literally.
But it also protects our atmosphere, doesn't it, in terms of solar winds? That's
Sure
the other
does,
interesting one. What'll happen there?
Well, extinctions of life don't correlate with changes in magnetic field, so we still have a magnetic field during those times. But it's a good point.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got one down here in the front.
Thank you. If Mawson had never gone to Antarctica and just come to Adelaide and been the professor of geology for 50 years, what would his reputation be?
Well, it'd probably be for geology, I guess, and if you're saying that he could still do that. Or
But would he be internationally known as a geologist, or would he be just a professor of geology
I think
at
that's
Adelaide
pretty hard
University?
to say, isn't it, really?
Look, I think he would have. Look, I think it was a time where there were relatively few academic geologists, and they were making some really major studies. To be honest, I suspect he would be known for his work on radioactive minerals, and I suspect he would have developed a lot in that sort of radium, because of course it was only in the 20s and 30s that people started exploring Irradium Hill dramatically, and Reg Sprigg was involved with that, for instance. So I suspect he might have been known more for that, but
Yes,
it's
he was
just guess.
fascinated with the whole issue of radioactive minerals, so I think he would have, I feel that perhaps he would have pursued that because it was just so interesting.
He would have died very early, yes, well maybe.
He was an early pioneer, so I think you're right. It would have definitely been radioactivity.
Anyone else? You got that? One here in the front third.
Did I hear the suggestion that if Mawson had gone on Scott's expedition, they might have done a whole lot better? And what does that offer you as a reflection on the Australian character versus the English character, or how do you like to interpret it?
I don't know who you're asking that one
Well,
to,
you
but
want to said it, Mark.
yeah, as a POM, I need to be careful here. I would hate to stereotype nationalities too much, particularly after the cricket we've had this summer, which Mawson wouldn't have approved me talking about either. I mean, Mawson strikes me as an extraordinary opportunist. You know, he just seized his chances, and they usually work their way through somewhere or another. I get the impression that Scott was perhaps a bit more of a muddler. And I'm not sure how they would have worked out. It's very interesting. One of the few people that Mawson talks about not liking when he met him was actually Wilson, Scott's chief scientist. And that was the reason he suggested that he wouldn't be joining Scott's expedition. That expedition was in 1910 to 1912, which fits in very convenient with me and my argument that the heroic era ended then. I think Mawson would have certainly shaken things up. One of Scott's strategies was to actually entice another Australian scientist to come along, a friend of Mawson's, Griff Taylor, who went on to great things and became quite a famous geographer. And Griff was, you know, notorious on the Scott expedition as this colonial. He wasn't the only colonial, there was one from Canada as well. But Griff was given the nickname Keir Hardie. Partly because of his politics. He believed in extraordinary things like, you know, giving women the vote. That didn't go down very well back in 1910. But he also, he had funny antics. He took the first bicycle to the Antarctic, and it nearly killed him, but he cycled around in a determined fashion. He went on to carry out some very important science. So, you know, the Australians got around, and Mawson would have been up there with the best of them, I think. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. I will end with one last point. If you look at Mawson's archive, and it includes everything that, you know, he did, it was all kept. Even applications from people that failed, even, you know, applications by Mawson to try and get funds and goods for the expedition. There's one paper there, which I've used a few times. He went to Pears, the suppliers of soap, who Shackleton had used, and he requested a quantity based on what Shackleton had used. And they wrote back to Mawson arguing, well, this is far too much. You know, Shackleton only needed about half of what you needed. Why are you asking for so much? And the suggestion has been that perhaps, you know, different hygiene habits may have made up the explanation. I can't substantiate that, but it gives you a glimpse of colonial differences, perhaps.
Yes?
Well, you have to remember that Mawson was born in England.
And a Yorkshireman, no less. Yes. Mother from the Isle of Man, father from Yorkshire. I think there's one word I've seen in the Antarctic diaries, nous, which seems to me a very Yorkshire word that he uses. So you know, he had his origins. I mean, I think he stamped his sheep with the Isle of Man symbol, the legs. This was the sheep that were up on the Meadows property. You know, he was quite proud of his origins. He was a historian. I mean, I think in a sense all geologists are. But he got very interested in human history as well, and clearly wanted to work out his place in that history.
I think we can get one more in, if any hands?
One at the back.
Oh, way in the back. Yes, sorry. I see it now against the camera, and way up at the very top. Oh, yes, go ahead, and then we'll move to the back. We've just got one ready now.
Alan, I've walked up Sturt Creek and haven't seen those rocks. Where should I look?
Oh, well, you must be blind. If you go right down into the gorge, there's a couple of little river cliffs just all the way up. And they don't look as pretty as some of those pictures. They're a bit scrappy now. There's actually in this paper, in this Houchin Geological London paper, 1908, there's some fantastic pictures of the Sturt Gorge with absolutely no vegetation in whatsoever. I don't know what they did to it. Now it's a bit of a battle to walk up right in the bottom of it. But it's the river cliffs there, yeah, right down the bottom, just a few hundred metres up from where South Road crosses it, particularly in the conservation park bit, just up there. They're there.
Okay, way in the back.
I just wanted to ask two questions. One was, are there any historical buildings in South Australia that relate to Mawson's life? And also, what was his, you mentioned he was a conservationist, what was his relationship with animals like, and were there investigations of biodiversity on the expeditions? Thank you.
So, historical buildings, Mark or Emma? Outside of the Mawson laboratories, which is historical for us.
That would be my top one, I think, really. I mean, he did live in other parts of Adelaide, so obviously the house on King Street in Brighton has been demolished, sadly. But he spent his early days, I believe, at the pub on the corner of West Terrace and North Terrace. Quite a pretty one if you want to go in there and have a drink and think of Mawson. He spent a little while in North Adelaide when he was pursuing Paquita. And I think they first met on the University Sports Grounds, not far from here, just across the river. The apartments just off Pulteney here. Do you want to mention that one, Emma?
Riven Mansions, which is on Pulteney Street, and he spent a bit of time there during the war, the Second World War. They rented out their house at Brighton and lived there in 2 apartments with their daughters Jessica and Pat, who were by then working at the university, and they were going to go to England on a family holiday, but then when war broke out they didn't go, but they thought they'd have a change anyway because they'd already arranged the renting out of their house. So, and I think there was another occasion earlier in their lives that while Paquita was early in their marriage, I think it was in between having Pat and Jessica.
And I think there's a hut out O'Leary way, which the...
Old Bukamata.
Yes. The National Park, which is definitely worth a visit to if you get the chance. So that's the easy one.
I mean, I would hope that during further celebrations this year, there might be the possibility of some tours of the Mawson laboratories, and particularly some of the areas where, in the crypts, where we store some of the materials that, we still store our materials, and where some of Mawson's materials are still stored.
I should say it's not quite architecture, but there's certainly a legacy around the university here, around the North Terrace campus. I keep on tripping over huge boulders in very strange places around the university, which a lot of them were on dredges from Mawson's expeditions, and I don't think the university could possibly move them. There's one outside the Elephant Building for some reason, which is up there.
And then the biodiversity question.
Yeah.
Anything in his persona or in his personal life that would give you indication that he did dabble in that area?
He was a member of the Field Naturalist Society. I know he wrote back to them on the BAE in 1907 apologising for not renewing his membership. And it seems a trivial point, but I think it comes back to that earlier point about him as a scientist. He was always filtering information, trying to obviously build up theories and demolish them, and short of a major paradigm shift, such as happened with continental drift, he was very good at looking at landscapes and eking out clues. A lot of the geology wasn't always evident, but for instance, plants gave you a very good clue as to what was underneath the thin layer of topsoil. So these are the ways I think Mawson sort of embraced a very sort of widespread sort of biodiversity or natural sort of history inclination that he had. He was a great sort of puzzler and trying to work always the puzzles that confronted him out with the evidence at hand. And it was at times pretty crude and simple, as I think you made it quite clear tonight. He'd had a field day today, and I think even towards the end of his life he was lamenting that he hadn't been born at a later age because things were just opening up, the science was becoming so dynamic. He was just always looking for opportunities.
Well,
I just forgot to say, if I could just interrupt, sorry, that I forgot to add that the Field Geology Club of South Australia is a wonderful group to join. They did a trip the end of last year to see the Inman Valley deposits you're talking about, and and other things towards Granite Island and Waipinga. Thank you.
No, folks, I would give that a plug also. The Field Geology Club is terrific, and they do some really good field trips. So I was keeping well to time, but now I haven't, so I'm afraid we have to wrap up the question. We're just starting to get rolling. I feel like we could now sort of go on for another hour and do this. But we're not doing that, so please join me in thanking the speakers.
Thank you so much. I was quite worried. I wanted to ask a question myself there about the flipping of the poles. I was quite concerned about that. My question would have been, if I'm driving home and the poles flip, will I still be able to find my way home?
Screwed.
It may mess up the GPS, yeah. Can I just let you know that there'll be a few more events. So there'll be a symposium. The Aurora Expedition Symposium will be on the 26th of February. A tour of the university's Tate Museum will be on the 24th of February. And an exhibition about Mawson's time here at the university will be held in the library here starting on the 18th of February. And you can find details about all of those on the university's website. I'll just mention two other things, if I may. The next Research Tuesday will be on the 11th of March, and we'll hear from behavioural economist, Associate Professor Ralph Baer, who will tell us about people's willingness and ability to cooperate in his talk, which is entitled, intriguingly, Why Shared Houses Are Always Dirty. That's from a behavioural economist. Should be fun. So let me conclude by thanking you enormously for coming along tonight to hear about the remarkable Mawson. Once again, please join me in thanking our facilitator and speakers tonight. Thank you.